After World War II, when we're talking about a post-war era after World War II, you have the Cold War going on. But here in the United States, you also have a huge boom in prosperity in terms of the economic prosperity of the United States, in terms of the political kind of stability for the United States. Even in the midst of the Cold War, the United States was not in active wartime and was reaping the benefits greatly from the way that the United States came out of World War II. So we're going to look at this post-war boom prosperity overall for the United States, and especially for certain groups in the United States, while at the same time excluding others. Okay. So when World War II was over, remember World War II is what really pulled the United States out of the Great Depression, reinvigorated industrial production in the United States, and set the United States as like a leading world superpower after World War II, considering Europe was greatly damaged by World War II, right? And many kind of colonial powers collapsed as a result of World War II to a certain extent, right? Or reorganized from their former structure. And the United States being where it was, not having active hot war on its actual, in the actual United States, benefited the U.S. greatly. However, when the war ended, there was a lot of collective concern of an economic slump after the war, which has been seen before, right? Is that you have this booming wartime industry, it lasts for a little while, and then you have a collapse, right, of that, when you go back to turning industrial production back towards consumer products. You also have a huge workforce that was deployed overseas now returning back home. So there was this kind of anxiety of like, okay, well, what is life going to be like after the war is over? Are we going to go back to, the situation we had beforehand, which was the Great Depression? It's going to be something similar to that. It's going to be similar to, slumps that have occurred before, after wartime. But there were differences this time, many, many differences from previous situations. One, remember right before World War II, in the Great Depression, the U.S. created the New Deal programs. And so now there was a sense that there's a safety net. Even if the economy gets bad again, at least there are certain safety nets that were not there before, right? There's now federal unemployment insurance. There's now minimum wage, so that when unemployment is high, right, workers can't be completely exploited into absolute abject poverty. There is at least a guarantee of a minimum wage. There's also Social Security benefits, especially for the elderly, right, and for people with certain disabilities. But even more than this, the thing that really catapulted so many people out of poverty and out of the working class, especially into the middle class, was the GI Bill of Rights. And so the GI Bill, or the GI Bill of Rights, was passed in order to kind of secure rights for those who enlisted in the military. And these are a lot of the things that we today kind of just take as like, take for granted as this is what you get when you join the military, which was not, for most of U.S. history, not always the case, right? So this set aside initially $13 billion for veterans education programs, vocational training programs, medical coverage, earmarked loans, housing loans, business loans, specifically for those who served. And so these are the things that we can say, oh yeah, that really greatly benefited people who joined the military. However, we can also look at this as part of a much larger shift in the U.S. towards a military-industrial complex, towards militarization, where you have, once the war ends, the U.S. does not pivot its industrial production completely back to consumer products. The U.S. continues to build its military. And this is where we have that growth of like government contracting, military contracting, a huge leap we're going to see over the next 4 decades in the United States after World War II in terms of military spending. And it's going to then enmesh U.S. industry and corporations with U.S. military, so that then you cannot ask the U.S. to scale back its military, because then people lose their jobs. Towns will lose their tax bases. People who have no other options, real viable options in terms of what to do after high school, lose these opportunities that only the military offers, right? And so it's no coincidence that there's not free health care, taxpayer, I shouldn't say free, taxpayer funded health care, universal health care, because if there was, perhaps fewer people would join the military. There are many people I know who never went to a dentist until they joined the military, right? Who waited till they got to the military to be able to get braces, or to get, certain kinds of medical care that they couldn't get before, right? So that's an incentive. If there was universal, college tuition coverage, if that, just like we have universal K through 12 education funding, if that was extended through university or college, then there would be less incentive for people to join the military. Many people I know also join the military for money for school. So you have to think about kind of these things can help people, but what do they do in the larger picture in terms of kind of supporting U.S. militarization? And as we've learned in this class, what are the impacts then of the U.S. having the most powerful military in the world in terms of what it then goes out and does? So everything's very tied together. You wouldn't think like, the kind of like, person who, lives in a farm community with very few options who joins the military, or the person who is a first generation immigrant who joins the military for opportunity. What are the ties to what's happening in foreign policy halfway around the world, right? It is tied together. And it goes back to this right here. These kinds of programs that are beneficial here on the ground to people. But if we pan out and look, what are their ties to the rest of the world? And it's no coincidence that this is happening during the Cold War era, when the United States is fighting against communist Russia for like global domination. As much as the U.S. is saying, oh, Russia wants to dominate the globe, this evil empire, the U.S. is doing the same thing, but couching it in, we're doing it for good versus they're evil. Likewise, in this Cold War, Russia is painting the United States in that same way, that the Russia is the one who is trying to free the world of this capitalist hold of the United States. So it's just a matter of perspective. So when Truman gets into office, as part of this kind of this push in this direction of the government providing certain kinds of social services, Truman extends the New Deal programs under his banner, the Fair Deal, because he not only extends these New Deal programs, he begins to incorporate consideration about civil rights and social welfare. Remember, in the New Deal program, a lot of African Americans were excluded because the New Deal programs excluded, for example, farm workers, right? Excluded, or agricultural workers, excluded domestic workers, which a lot of African Americans did for, that was their work. Many of the Fair Deal programs were segregated, right? And then also only allowed men only. So Truman's Fair Deal took the New Deal programs and tried to rework them so that more people could be more equitably included, especially after a war, right, in which the U.S. is talking about fighting for this freedom and this equality and these basic rights of people abroad. You had the African American soldiers fighting the Double V campaign for victory against racism at home. So there's this kind of push there. Well, in that effort, a lot of Southern Democrats objected. Remember, Truman was Truman was a Democrat, right? But the Democratic Party at this time was split. You had like kind of Northern Democrats like President Roosevelt, President Truman, and then you had the Southern Democrats, which were like aligned with the Klan from the old times of the Civil War, right? This is when you begin to see the incremental movement of Southern Democrats to the Republican Party. And that's over the 1950s and 60s and especially the 70s and 80s. You have that kind of complete transition of what the Democratic Party and Republican parties used to be, now kind of almost switched. Okay. In 1948, Truman ran for the office of president. Remember, he became president when Franklin Roosevelt died in office, and Truman was vice president. Then he runs for president on his own, and he narrowly wins re-election and serves in that term. And then in the next election, you have the pendulum swing back away from the Democratic Party with Truman back to the Republican Party. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a general during World War II, he runs and gets elected president, and he runs with his vice president, Richard Nixon, who of course will come back up and run for president, the office of president in the 1960s and 70s. So Eisenhower was a middle-of-the-road Republican, not a far right, not a extreme. He was a middle-of-the-road Republican, like many of the people who get elected, as we've seen so far, kind of run like in the middle of the road, playing that kind of politics in order to kind of appeal to the most amount of people. But he ran on the platform of what was called dynamic conservatism, being conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. So supporting social welfare programs to take care of people, but also being conservative when it comes to, let's say, government spending in a variety of ways. He was very, very big on talking tough on communism. However, he was very soft on racism. And whereas Truman was vocally, talking about this fair deal and addressing the inequalities that were written into this post-war boom, and partially why he gets elected, Eisenhower pulls back on that and is like, well, the more we talk about racism, the more it's going to be a problem, was his kind of mentality on it. And so many issues did not get addressed. And of course, this is right on the eve of the civil rights movement. And so this idea of like, well, let's just leave things alone and like not kick up the dirt about racism, that wasn't going to fly, right? As more and more people are saying, well, we're living this reality. You need to talk about it. You need to address these things because we're Americans too and we're voters too. All right, that takes us to this, the first part of this week's writing assignment. Writing assignment number 12. There are 2 questions in total for the writing assignment. The first part of the writing assignment is one question that goes with these sections: the consumer revolution and the baby boom. You learn about where the baby boom and the term boomers originates. So you're going to read about that in the textbook and give reasons for why the baby boom happened according to the textbook. So we're going to look at some of the domestic impacts of this prosperity, this great economic growth after World War II. So one major outcome of this all was the creation of suburbia. And tied to creating the suburbs or suburbia, and suburbia is like this, not only the place of the suburbs, and the suburbs are the communities that are built outside of the inner city, outside of the city center. As we go into the 1950s, the end of the 1940s and especially into the 1950s, you have not only the growth of like these housing tracts that are built outside in the peripheral or kind of outlying areas around the city, outside of the city, you also have like a kind of culture that develops with this, right? A certain way of life, a certain look and aesthetic that goes with this suburban kind of life. And it becomes kind of the quintessential American dream, American kind of stereotype, not only here in the U.S., but around the world. And this happens at the same time that television becomes popular. And they're gonna kind of work together to create this image and tie in capitalism in terms of advertising and consumer products. So in World War II, there was a huge inner city housing shortage as people were coming from all different parts of the United States, especially rural areas, especially the South, to cities to work in the war industry. But you also have soldiers who were being deployed, and as they were being deployed during World War II, right, they're they're being stationed in various cities, right? And they get exposed to these cities, many of them coming from small towns or rural areas. And that exposure to the city then prompts, after the war is over, people moving to these more urban areas as well. So during World War II, there was this housing shortage, right? There was so many workers in the cities and not enough housing stock to accommodate it. So once the war is over, and now there's no more needing to, cut back on using resources. Now there's no war effort that you have to like cut back on, metals and lumber and everything for. Now those resources are freed up, and now there is a push for developing new housing, and new housing that's going to fit this growing middle class, the middle class which New Deal programs create. With not only with the GI Bill, right, these returning veterans now have access to specifically veteran home loans that they can now buy a suburban home with. When they were before the war, maybe working class or like rural poor people, now they're able to access these VA loans and they're able to buy houses. Along with that, you have from the New Deal program, the Federal Housing Administration created a 30-year mortgage, right? And these federally backed home loans. So now people who had no chance of buying a house previously, now with their VA loans, and now people with lower mortgages because now they qualify for these federal home loans, and many more people have better paying jobs because now they've gotten employed in the war industry and other growing industries like aerospace, right? The defense industries begin to grow, aerospace begins to grow, right? This is when you have like airplane companies become huge employers of people, right? You have various defense industries, people are working building munitions, but also kind of the chemicals industry. You have, like I said, aerospace, right? Like JPL here in LA and McDonnell Douglas and, all these different aerospace industries in places like Los Angeles and what we call the Sun Belt, right? So these kind of West Coast cities where people can live this suburban dream, moving out to sunny suburbs and good paying jobs. People have the money to put down for a home. These new homes are being built. They're being built specifically for this class of people who are ascending into the middle class, who are going to have these stable jobs, who want to start families, right? Returning soldiers, young people, and who are now going to have this expendable income from these new jobs. And so this huge explosion of consumerism, right, takes over the United States with also, you have radio and movies, but you have now the advent of television as well and advertising on TV. You have this, and then as you read, the baby boom, right, as people now are finding the stability of having a home, wartime is over, people are now starting families to kind of get back to normalcy. You have a baby boom, like a much higher ratio of children are born during this time period. And as they are born and their parents have all this income and people are having fewer children than in the past, right? People are having 2.5 children. There's more money to spend on their children, right? And so a lot of advertising now gets marketed towards children. And this is where you have toys Howdy Doody and hula hoops and, cowboys and Indians toys and Barbies and all this stuff start to really flood the market in a way that it was never the case before, right? Toy manufacturing becomes huge at this time. And then in the 1950s and 60s, you'll have a huge teen population, right? And into the 70s that are going to be a huge market for people as well. And this is when you begin to have rock and roll and kind of this teen culture that comes into movies and into radio, and you have teen celebrities and TV and stuff like that. All of this develops at the same time. The suburbs develop housing tracts, right? So construction companies began to develop these huge housing tracts that create uniform model homes, and they are outside the city. And so many people still continue to work in the city, but now they're going to live in the suburbs. And so freeway development becomes huge. This is not only a matter of getting people to buy cars, right? As part of the American dream, your house and your car and your driveway, that allows for you to work in the city and then commute out to your home. It's a common way of life for many people today, right? But it was also kind of sold as a national security issue, right? Is that this huge funding went into creating a national highway system, and the federal government passed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956 to put lots and lots of money to develop. This is when like the 10 freeway, for example, was built. And most of our cities, or our freeways here in Los Angeles, really get built or heavily extended to feed the suburbs that are being built. And this was a way to, like I was saying, in Cold War, to protect national security, because to have only one road in and out of a city, or only a few roads, is a threat, because if that road gets bombed, or if we get attacked, it's limiting our means of transportation. So what ends up happening is in the inner cities, many of the rail cars, the public transit lines, get defunded, and the money gets steered instead towards the building of freeways, which of course is going to benefit one group of people over another, those who can afford to move out to the suburbs versus those who cannot. But not only a matter of money, because there are actually going to be many people who have enough money to buy homes in the suburbs, but who are still going to be stuck in the cities because of race. Because many of the suburbs that get built are going to be restricted by race. They're going to be white-only suburbs. So you have this huge movement away from using tax dollars to fund things that the general public can use. And now that money is going to be steered towards subsidizing private developments, because the freeway system is going to be beneficial to those development companies that are building these housing tracts on the periphery, right? And then that's going to cut out a whole segment of people. So like I said, with this, you have this whole new suburban aesthetic and this consumerism that comes with it. And Disneyland really is a perfect vehicle for this, or representation of this, rather. And a lot has been written about Disneyland. But if you're interested in this time period and how Disneyland is tied in with this here in Southern California, there's a really great book by Eric Avila, who is a LA historian, who writes about white flight, which is the phenomenon that we're during this time period of, and even now with gentrification. You have reverse kind of white flight, but it's still white flight in the sense that because white people are a privileged class in this country, right? And of course that means that historically and systemically there are ways that generationally white people have benefited from policies that we've talked about here and been able to kind of pass that on. But then also in the day-to-day interactions, there is privilege in the assumptions that people make about you and the treatment that you get in every facet of life, right? So white people as a privileged group have had the ability to, more of the ability to choose where they live, right? And so during this time, in this, when these suburbs are being built, you have the cities are overcrowded with housing shortage, and the only new housing that's really being built is in the suburbs. And many of those suburbs are only accessible to white people. So you have many people leaving the inner city out to the suburbs. And that's what we call white flight, is like white people in mass moving out of an area, which then leaves everyone behind with because usually when white flight happens, taking a lot of capital with them. And because these are the top earners in the United States, many businesses will follow the white flight too. And so this is when you have like downtown LA. Many of the major department stores are going to close down during this period, because as people flee out to the suburbs, they're taking their money with them. And this is when we begin to have the development of malls out in the suburbs. And that leaves then the inner cities economically depressed as the tax base moves out. It leaves less employment opportunities and so on. And then you have the shift of civic money and county money and state money going towards the suburbs to develop those places and leaving the inner city neglected, right? So anyway, Eric Avila writes a book called, I can't remember what it is, In the Age of White Flight, It's about Los Angeles, but there's a chapter about Disneyland, and Disneyland being created to feed this aesthetic, to appeal to the folks that were like wanting a suburban form of entertainment, unlike Coney Island, or unlike kind of like, the old-timey Long Beach Pier, the Pike, that people like Walt Disney, and in his own experience, he was horrified when he went to Coney Island, right? Because there was like a mix of so many different types of people, and there was no organization, and it was like gritty, and, he found it scary. He wanted to build the opposite of a Coney Island, a very privatized, sanitized, controlled amusement park that appealed to the suburban aesthetic. And so when he chose where Disneyland was going to be, it's no coincidence he chose Anaheim, right? In rapidly developing suburban Orange County, which is where many folks from Los Angeles, in this white flight, fled to get away from, what was perceived as like, the negative inner city. And there's a lot of things about Disneyland and the way Walt Disney created it that appealed to suburbanites, in the sense of like there was like this nostalgia for some old time when America was a certain way that appealed to this memory that especially white Californians had, right? And then there's a play up of ultra patriotic, very exclusive view of history that was represented in Frontierland and in Song of the South kind of things that were the story that many Americans had received in history class. So the reality is that many people did have access to the middle class as a result of all of these programs, all these developments, what people will call progress. But the reality is the progress is not equally accessible. Many people are left behind, and it's along the lines of race and of class, right? And so while you have this huge group of people ascending to, a more stable economic situation, and then once they get, their own home and their own property, they become even more entrenched in maintaining the status quo and less likely to push for, more social services for people, more equitable programs for people. And so you have this widening of inequality that happens during this period. So as many people are making it, many people are left behind. And there's a sociologist, Michael Harrington, during this period who is examining this phenomenon that's happening in the U.S. As much as people are like, watching Leave It to Beaver and, like thinking, this is a suburban dream, Americans have it made, was putting out a warning of like, this is not most people. This is not most people in the United States that have access to this. And so he writes this book called The Other America, looking at the people who are just like in the Gilded Age. Remember during industrialization, how everyone's like, wow, there's, so much progress and success and prosperity. And then Jacob Riis is like, well, look at the price of this. Look at how many people have to suffer for this. Look at how many people are being left out of this so that a few people can have a lot of stuff. Michael Harrington in the 1950s is pointing out the same thing. Yeah, there's people with these, suburban homes and their car in the driveway and all their electric appliances and everything. But 25%, a quarter of the U.S. population was living in poverty. And I'm not just talking about like, you can't, you don't own a house, you don't have a car. Poverty, right? Like there were people in rural Appalachia with no electricity in their homes. You have people living on reservations with no running water in their homes, or even anywhere in their area, right? Still digging wells. You have people in the inner city without trash services, without adequate textbooks in the schools. You have huge unemployment concentrated within certain poverties. Again, within rural white communities, you have black and brown inner cities that are being heavily neglected. And it has a lot to do with where federal funding is being poured into and where programs are being created and for whom, right? And so Michael Harrington kind of is shining a light on this. And eventually that would lead to a federal government campaign called the War on Poverty under President Lyndon Johnson, which we'll talk about later. Much of this difference in development comes through segregation. And not just Jim Crow segregation, which was still going on in the South, but the segregation that had been going on outside of the South in so many different ways. And you'll be watching a video about de facto and de jure segregation. So de facto is segregation that is actually happening on the ground. De jure segregation is segregation that is mandated by law. And both of these work together to create essentially two different worlds. When you're talking about like, American life, although it can be very different things depending on your race, your location, your class, your immigration status, very different experiences. And so you're going to watch a short video about that. The video is going to talk a lot about white flight, how these new suburbs developed, and how the fact that they were closed to non-white people for a long time in a number of ways is going to impact how we even live here today in our current life. The ways, and then in our current world, we're seeing reverse white flight, right? As the suburbs became places of, white communities, and then as laws changed after the civil rights movement, and saying you can't not rent to non-white people. You can't write it into your contract that you can only sell your house to white people. That was the way things were done, right? Up until the 1950s, in many states. People in the 1950s and 60s, being the first non-white family to move into a neighborhood, were still getting their houses firebombed and, riots happening to, attack people who wanted to move into a white neighborhood. Once those things were no longer allowed, and then Black and brown people or non-white people are allowed to move out into the suburbs like Alhambra and Pasadena and Covina and Burbank, which were primarily white only, now are going to see non-white people moving out to them. As that happens, you're eventually over time going to have a reverse, as the inner city now is kind of abandoned. As more and more people are able to move into the suburbs, you're going to have a reverse movement of gentrification as developers began to redevelop abandoned inner cities and then flip them over now to being kind of high-end or luxury. It's what we're living in right now. Okay. So we have the reverse of that back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, to where there's this line in this Parliament song where they talk about vanilla suburbs and chocolate cities, right? And so you have the inner city being synonymous with Black and brown people, and then the suburbs being kind of synonymous with white people and white life. As the inner cities were abandoned, you began to have claims that the inner city was full of urban blight, meaning look at this, the slums in the inner city. Look at this, how they let the inner city decay. And then you ended up having the people who are living in poverty, who don't even make these choices and who are actually the least able to do anything about it, being blamed for the lack of services and the lack of opportunity, for crime, for lack of, sanitation and cleanliness, which is actually the result of these policies. But now you have people and their character and their communities being saddled with, they caused this, right? And as a result, cities began to move forward with slum clearance, that's what it was called, and also urban renewal, where they began to bulldoze housing projects and older apartments and houses and trying to rebuild them. And that set the stage for a lot of the gentrification that we have today. You also have the issue of gender that comes up in the post-war period, right? And it ties in with many of the things we're talking about with the suburbs. It's no coincidence that in the 1950s, with the suburban development, you have television and advertising playing upon suburban ideas of what a proper family is going to look like. And we go back to those gender roles that come out of industrialization. As men were coming back from the war, and as women had taken a lot of jobs in the war industry, there was this anxiety I mentioned of what's the man's place now? And are women going to even need men? And, what's going to happen to the American family and all this stuff, right? And so there's this attempt at returning to normalcy, what was viewed as American normalcy. And so many women were pushed out of their jobs, even if they wanted to keep them, even if they weren't married, even if they didn't have someone to support them economically. It was like deemed like that men were entitled to these jobs. These are rightfully men's jobs. And so women got pushed out of work as men were hired to replace them. There was no, federal laws against gender discrimination. In fact, in many federal programs, like the New Deal programs we talked about that got extended, discrimination was open, right? Is that no, we don't hire women for these positions. No women are not allowed to apply for these positions. They're not allowed to apply for this grant or this loan. Up until the 1970s, women could not get a credit card without a male guardian signing for it in the United States. Women could not take out bank loans without a male guardian signing for them. Literally, this is in the 1970s. I was born in the 1970s. It's like you couldn't do that. So I think about people of my mom's generation. You had to get married in order to be able to access some basic things. And this was a way to push for this normalcy, this rightful place of women in the home being married without rights keeping them in those marriages, right? As a result of this, the marriage rate went up and the baby boom occurred, right? And this was supported by images in the media, right? Magazines like Better Homes and Gardens, shows like My Three Sons or Leave It to Beaver. I didn't watch those growing up. Those are from the 1950s, but like on Nick at Night or reruns or whatever, you can find these shows where it's the wife in the apron, kind of like I Love Lucy, right? At home, unable to make a lot of choices without first going through the husband. This kind of gender inequality, these roles of the private and the public sphere. And then really the image of what is a real woman. Again, harkening back to those industrial revolution gender spheres, trying to work that back into the system after women had already had the experience of being in the cities and working and finding like, oh, I can support myself and I'm capable of doing these things. There was a really big push to like erase that and go back to this. But, women are people and they want the opportunities that they had seen a glimpse of in those war periods. And so within the suburban life, as much as these images on television and movies and in magazines, in classes like home economics that were geared towards women, right, with the assumption that like men don't need these skills, like you don't need to know how to feed yourself and take care of yourself because you just get married and a woman will be your servant in that way. These classes were geared towards women, and women felt their options were so limited in this suburban landscape. And then there was a lot that came out of that in terms of starting with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, writing about there was this sense that like this suffocation that women were experiencing. And you're going to read a little bit about that in the textbook for the last part of this week's writing assignment. You're going to read about women in the 1950s and answer this question. Describe the major changes, sorry for the typo, that impacted women during this time according to the textbook.